Imagine being crowned as queen at the age of 12, only to realize your mother has married you off to an old man, her own husband, a man you're now forced to call your own. This isn't a fairy tale. This is a story of power, betrayal, and survival. Before we dive deeper into this shocking story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the dramatic twists ahead. And don't forget to leave a comment with your thoughts. What would you do if you were in her shoes? The air was thick with the scent of incense, the soft murmur of courtiers echoing around the grand hall. The young girl, her face a mask of stoic grace, stood before a crowd that had gathered to witness her coronation. The delicate crown, golden and adorned with gemstones, rested uneasily on her head, as if it too sensed the weight of the future it now marked. At only 12 years old, Elira was more than just a figurehead. She was the queen. Her mother, Queen Verena, had seen to that. But as the last echoes of the coronation bell faded, a far darker truth began to set in. The moment the ceremony ended, her mother's hand found hers, leading her through the sea of faces. Elira's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She had no say in this. She had no say in anything. She had been groomed for this moment, trained to hold herself like royalty, to speak with authority, to command with a voice that could shake mountains. But no one had prepared her for what came after the crown. She glanced up at her mother, her beautiful, powerful mother, whose smile had always been so reassuring. Today, though, that smile felt wrong. It was a mask, thinly veiling something darker. Her mother's eyes flickered briefly to the side, catching the gaze of the man who had been waiting by the throne, the man who would soon become her husband, the man whose age far surpassed hers by decades. He was old enough to be her grandfather, with weathered skin and eyes full of greed. Illyria tried not to shudder. This was her fate, to be married off to him, to a man whose wrinkled hands would soon be all over her life, literally and metaphorically. But what could she do? She was a queen, yes, but also a pawn in a game she could neither see nor understand. As her mother led her down the marble steps, she whispered, "Elira, there's something you need to know. This is for the kingdom. You're not just a queen, you're a tool." The words hit her like a slap, sharp and stinging. A tool. Her mother's voice held the coldness of someone who had made this choice long ago. Before Elira could respond, the man approached. His presence was suffocating. He towered over her, his eyes gleaming with a mix of lust and power. "Elira," he said, his voice rough and hoarse, "I trust you'll make this marriage a prosperous one for us all." His fingers brushed against hers, sending a wave of disgust through her, and she instinctively pulled her hand back, her pulse racing. But she said nothing. What could she say? Her mother stood behind her, a silent observer to the silent contract now sealed between them. Illyria's world had just been flipped upside down, and all she could do was stand there, a queen who had not asked for the crown but was forced to wear it. The reality of her situation began to sink in. This marriage wasn't just about politics, it was about survival. And Elira would soon learn that no one in this court, not her mother nor the man she had been forced to marry, cared whether she lived or died. They only cared about power, and the power they sought was hers. The days following the coronation blurred into one suffocating whirlwind of forced smiles, stiff etiquette, and endless formalities. The vast corridors of the palace, once a place of wonder to Elira, now felt like a prison. She was trapped not by walls, but by the invisible chains of her own bloodline. her mother's cold, calculating decisions, and the expectations of an entire kingdom. The worst part? She couldn't escape her own reflection. Everywhere she went, there she was, sitting on that golden throne, a symbol of power. But it was the illusion of power. In reality, Elira was nothing more than a pawn in a game that was far beyond her control. It was one thing to wear the crown for a ceremony, to play the role of the queen, but it was entirely different to live with the consequences, to sleep beside the man who had been wed to her mother, to feel his eyes on her, his presence looming over her every moment, his wrinkled face, his breath thick and foul, the way he touched her, like a predator who had finally claimed his prey. That night after a state banquet, Elira was summoned to her chambers. The old man, her husband, was waiting there. The grand tapestries and luxurious furnishings did little to mask the dread that filled the room. He sat on the bed, his hands clasped together, eyes gleaming with a predatory curiosity as she entered. "Come here, Elira," he called, his voice deep and rough. Her legs refused to move at first. The words caught in her throat, and for a fleeting moment, she wished she could vanish into the walls. But the weight of the crown was still on her head, even if it wasn't physically there. It weighed heavier with every passing second. Slowly she walked toward him, feeling the cold floor beneath her bare feet, the eyes of the palace guards silently watching her from the hall. There was no escape, no sanctuary, except perhaps the one place she would never be allowed to go: her own mind. "You've been quite distant, Elira," he said, his voice more grating than ever. "But I understand. This is a big change for you." He patted the empty space beside him. Elira froze. The moment he spoke those words, everything in her body screamed to run, to flee, to do anything but this, but she couldn't. "Sit," he commanded, as though it were an order to a servant, not a queen. His gaze was cold, expectant. She had no choice. With a deep breath, she complied, sitting at the farthest edge of the bed, trying to put as much distance as possible between them. His eyes followed her every movement, and the air between them grew thick with something unpleasant, something that reminded her of a wolf sizing up its prey. "I know this isn't easy for you," he said, his voice almost patronizing, as if speaking to a child. "But you're the queen now, and you're mine. We both have our duties to this kingdom, Elira. Remember that." His words were poison, each one dripping with the venom of control. The longer she sat there, the more she felt his power seep into her skin. He wasn't just her husband. He was the embodiment of everything she despised about this life, this world, this forced role she now had to play. But Elira wasn't just any girl. She was the queen. And while she may not have chosen this fate, she would learn how to use it to her advantage. "I understand," she said, her voice betraying none of the fear she felt inside. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she held her composure. "I'm not a child anymore," she reminded herself. "I'm a queen." The man seemed to study her for a moment, his gaze darkening, though he said nothing more. Instead, he leaned back against the headboard, sighing with a sense of satisfaction that made Elira's stomach churn. This was her reality now. Her life had been stolen from her. The world she had dreamed of, one of freedom, of possibility, was gone. But she wasn't going to let it end like this. As she lay down in the bed later that night, her mind raced. She could feel the weight of the crown still pressing down on her skull, but she also felt something else, a flicker of something. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was a spark. A realization that she wasn't entirely powerless. Not yet. The game had just begun, and Elira would learn how to play it, even if it meant becoming something darker than she ever imagined. Days passed in a haze of cold stares, whispered secrets, and unspoken expectations. Elira's new life was nothing like the fairy tales she had once dreamed of. The palace was a gilded cage, beautiful but suffocating. Every movement she made, every word she spoke seemed to be under the watchful eye of her mother, the courtiers, and the man she was now wed to, her husband. Her mother, the queen who had orchestrated all of this, appeared only when absolutely necessary, her visits cold and distant. Elira had grown used to her mother's detached gaze, but there was something more chilling about the way she looked at her now. She wasn't just a mother anymore. She was a monarch, a player in the great game of politics, and Elira was merely another piece on the board. But Elira wasn't content to sit idly by. If this was her fate, she would fight for some semblance of control. And the first battle was about power, control over her own life, over her position as queen, and over the people who saw her as nothing more than a tool. It started with the whispers, whispers about the old man, about how he was losing his grip on the kingdom. Whispers about Elira herself, how she was too young to rule, how her marriage to such an old man would weaken the throne. But in those whispers, Elira found an opportunity. The first time it happened, she was in her chambers, sitting by the window, watching the sunset. She heard the soft tapping of a knuckle against the door. Elira didn't have to ask who it was. She recognized the figure standing on the other side, Joran, one of the royal advisors, a man whose loyalty seemed as fluid as the shifting tides. "Your Majesty," Joran greeted her, his voice low and respectful, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something more, a hint of something else, something that might be of use to her. "What do you want, Joran?" Elira's voice was cool, composed, but her heart raced. She had learned quickly that the people around her were never as they seemed. "I come with information," he said, stepping closer. "It seems there are dissenters, people who believe your marriage is a mistake, people who believe he will be the ruin of this kingdom." Elira's gaze hardened. The he referred to was her husband, the old man who had taken what little agency she had left. But what did Joran want from her? "And why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice calm but sharp, testing him. "Because I believe you can do something about it, Your Majesty," Joran said, his words deliberate, as though he were treading carefully around a trap. "And because I think you're not as helpless as they believe you to be." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge, a promise. Elira knew that Joran wasn't the only one who thought this way. Her marriage, this political maneuver, was being whispered about in every corner of the palace. Some feared her strength, others saw her as a pawn, but there were those who believed she could change the course of the kingdom, if only she had the courage to do so. "I don't want to be a puppet, Joran," Elira said, her voice suddenly steely. "I may be 12, but I'm still the queen, and I will not be controlled." Joran's eyes glinted. "That's why I'm here. I want to help you." Elira studied him carefully. She wasn't naive enough to trust him fully, but in this world of treachery, alliances could be formed out of necessity, and she needed all the help she could get if she wanted to survive. "Then help me," she said finally, her voice steady with newfound resolve. "Tell me what I need to know." Joran nodded, a faint smile curling at the corner of his lips. "There are powerful factions in the court, Your Majesty. Your mother, for all her power, is not the only one with influence. The old man may have control now, but his health is failing. And you, Illyra, are the key. The realization hit Illyra like a lightning bolt. She wasn't just a pawn. She was the queen. And this kingdom, this throne, could still be hers if she played her cards right. But first she needed allies, those who were willing to take risks, those who were as tired of the old man's reign as she was. She had made her first move. It was subtle, but it was a start. Joran continued, outlining the complex web of alliances and rivalries that ran through the palace. The old man's ministers, the courtiers, even her own mother, all had their own motivations. The more Illyra listened, the clearer it became. Everyone wanted something from her, but she couldn't give them everything. She couldn't be their pawn, but she could make them think she was. The days stretched on, filled with whispers, promises, and subtle power plays. Illyra's life, once defined by innocence and playfulness, was now a carefully orchestrated dance of survival. She had already learned one crucial lesson: trust no one. Her conversations with Joran had been scarce, but each one left her more aware of the intricate web of politics surrounding her. He had spoken of factions within the court, of old alliances and even older rivalries. The kingdom wasn't just ruled by the old man. It was controlled by a myriad of hidden hands pulling the strings. But even amidst the shadows, there were glimmers of hope. There were people who didn't want the old man on the throne, people who wanted change. And some of them, surprisingly, had begun to see Illyra as the key to that change. Her mother's cold indifference was both a blessing and a curse. As long as she remained distant, Illyra could act without her interference. But it also left her isolated, vulnerable. Her mother, after all, had her own agenda, one that didn't involve Illyra's happiness. One evening, after a particularly taxing banquet, Illyra returned to her chambers. The palace seemed quieter than usual, almost empty, as if the walls themselves had grown tired of the endless plotting and scheming. She had barely closed the door behind her when a soft knock echoed from the other side. Her pulse quickened. It was Joran. "Your Majesty," he greeted her, his voice low and urgent. He didn't wait for permission before stepping inside. "We need to move quickly." Illyra raised an eyebrow. "What's happened?" "The old man has been weakening," Joran explained, glancing over his shoulder to ensure they were alone. "His health is deteriorating faster than anyone expected. Word is, he won't last much longer. The court is already positioning themselves for what comes next. There are two factions vying for control, and one of them has already reached out to me." Illyra's mind raced. She had known that the old man's health was fragile, but hearing it confirmed was a different matter entirely. If the throne was up for grabs, the stakes were higher than ever. Whoever held the power in the palace would dictate the future of the kingdom, and Illyra's own future. "Which faction?" she asked, keeping her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Joran's eyes flickered with a hint of wariness. "The more influential one, the one with the gold and the soldiers. They're offering me a position of power, but I've refused them." Illyra frowned. "Why?" "Because I don't trust them," he replied, his tone hardening. "They think they can control me, use me as a pawn. But I'm not just looking for power. I'm looking for a way to give you a chance." The words hit Illyra like a thunderclap. She had expected this, politicians who saw her as a means to an end. But hearing it from Joran made it feel real. She was the piece they wanted to move, the key to securing their futures. And yet somehow, Joran had been different. He was playing a dangerous game, and he wanted her to be a part of it. I'm not just a pawn, Alira said quietly, her eyes narrowing. I'm the queen, and I will never let anyone think they control me. Joran studied her for a long moment, the flicker of approval in his gaze unmistakable. Good. That's what I wanted to hear. He leaned closer, his voice dropping even lower. There's another faction, though, one that has been quietly building its power in the shadows. They believe in you, Elira. They think you're the future of this kingdom, not the old man, not your mother. And they're willing to fight for you. Elira's heart skipped a beat. Who are they? Joran hesitated, then spoke in a hushed tone. Some of the most trusted guards in the palace, the officers loyal to your mother, a few key nobles, and some of the people who served your late father. They're all waiting for the right moment. Illyra took a deep breath, trying to process the whirlwind of information. It was more than she had hoped for, but it was also more dangerous. If word of this got out, if anyone suspected she was aligning herself with factions within the court, it would mean her death. But this was her chance. If she played it right, if she made the right moves, Elira could not only survive, but she could seize the throne from under everyone's nose. I need more, Elira said firmly. I need to know where they stand. I need to know who my enemies are, who will fight beside me, and who will try to destroy me. Joran nodded. I'll bring you the information. But remember, trust no one but yourself. Elira nodded, her mind already turning over the possibilities. She had to make her move carefully. One false step, and the entire court would turn against her. But there was power in the shadows, and Elira was beginning to realize that perhaps she didn't have to be a puppet after all. The night was silent, heavy with the weight of the decisions Elira had just begun to make. Joran's visit had left her both exhilarated and terrified. There was power in the shadows, and she now had a glimpse of it. But power, as she was learning, came at a steep price, and she was no longer certain if she was ready to pay it. The days that followed were filled with tension. Elira had carefully taken Joran's advice to heart. Trust no one but herself. She couldn't afford to let her guard down, not even with the few people who had shown her some semblance of loyalty. She had to remain sharp, calculating, and above all, in control. But the pressure was mounting. Every move she made, every glance exchanged, every conversation, everything was a potential trap. The palace felt like a maze of shifting alliances, and Elira was caught in the middle, with no clear way out. Her husband, though increasingly frail, continued to exert his influence over the court, keeping the ministers and nobles in check with his age and authority. But even he could feel his grip slipping. His health was failing faster than anyone anticipated, and the court was growing restless. His illness was no longer a secret. It was an open wound, a weakness that others were quick to exploit. Elira was aware of the growing number of factions within the court, each one eager to take advantage of the old man's decline. Her own mother, though seemingly indifferent to her daughter's fate, had her own ambitions. The queen was maneuvering in ways that Elira could not yet understand, but she could feel the subtle pressure building. Her mother was a woman who knew how to play the game, and Elira had learned in these past weeks that there was no room for weakness in this world. One morning, as Elira sat in her chambers, staring out the window at the sprawling gardens below, the door opened, and Joran entered without knocking. His face was grim, his usual composure replaced by an unsettling urgency. Elira, he said quietly, his voice tight with anxiety, we need to talk. It's about your mother. Elira's heart skipped a beat. The queen was always a step ahead of her, always watching from the shadows. She had been trying to figure out her mother's game for weeks, and now Jorn was offering her a glimpse behind the curtain. "What's happened?" she asked, her voice steady despite the unease that churned inside her. Jorn stepped closer, his eyes scanning the room, as if ensuring no one else could overhear. "Your mother has made a move. She's formed an alliance with the faction that's been quietly rising in the court, the one with the soldiers and the gold." Illyra's pulse quickened. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was a blow. Her mother had never been the type to act without a plan, and now that she had aligned herself with one of the most dangerous factions, the stakes had just been raised. "You're telling me she's supporting them?" Illyra asked, her voice cold with disbelief. Joran nodded. "She's playing both sides, Illyra. She's building her own power base, making sure that when the old man dies, she'll be in the position to take control." A sickening realization began to take root in Illyra's chest. Her mother had used her, had married her off to the old man, not for the sake of the kingdom, but for her own political gain. The queen didn't care about Illyra's happiness. She only cared about securing her own place on the throne. "How could she?" Illyra's voice faltered for a moment, the betrayal cutting deeper than she'd expected. "All these years I thought she was doing this for me, for us." Jorn's gaze softened, but there was no pity in it. "You were never part of the equation, Illyra. You were just the instrument she needed to secure her power." The truth hit Illyra like a slap in the face. Her mother had never cared about her as a daughter. She had used her as a means to an end, a pawn in a game she had long since mastered. "Then what do I do now?" Illyra asked, her voice hardening with a newfound resolve. "I can't just sit back and let her steal everything from me." Jorn's lips twisted into a thin, almost grim smile. "You fight, Illyra. You don't let anyone control you. You take back what's yours." His words struck a chord deep within her. This wasn't just about the throne anymore. It was about her freedom, her agency, her life. She wasn't going to be anyone's pawn, not her mother's, not her husband's, not anyone's. But Jorn's advice came with its own cost. If she wanted to fight, she would have to make dangerous choices. She would have to risk everything, her life, her future, and perhaps even the people who had been closest to her. But it was a risk she was willing to take. She wasn't a child anymore, and she would no longer be treated as one. The battle for the throne had begun in earnest, and Illyra was prepared to do whatever it took to come out on top. The next few days were a blur of frantic planning, hushed conversations, and hidden meetings. Illyra's life had become a constant game of shadow and light, where every step she took felt calculated, deliberate, and necessary. She had no illusions left. This wasn't just a political struggle, it was a battle for her very survival. Her mother, the queen, had aligned herself with the most powerful faction in the court, securing her own position as the next ruler. The old man's decline had accelerated, and every day that passed brought Illyra closer to the inevitable conflict. The kingdom was poised on the edge of chaos, and every faction was making its move. But Illyra had no intention of letting her mother, or anyone else, take the throne without a fight. It started with small, subtle shifts. She had spent the last few weeks quietly building alliances with those who were dissatisfied with the status quo. Some of the palace guards, a few of the more influential nobles, even some of the ministers who had once been loyal to her father. These were the people who now whispered her name in the shadows, who saw her not as a mere child, but as the queen in waiting. The most dangerous part of her plan, however, was the one she hadn't yet shared with anyone. Elira had learned that there were two things that could bring down even the most powerful ruler: betrayal and fear. She needed both, and she knew exactly where to strike. One evening, as the moon cast a pale light over the palace, Elira stood at the window of her chambers, watching the guards below. She had learned to watch them without ever being noticed, to listen to their footsteps and the subtle changes in their movements. The palace was a labyrinth of secrets, and every stone seemed to whisper something new. Jarin had kept his promise, feeding her information, helping her navigate the treacherous waters of the court. He had told her of the faction that was supporting her mother, the one with the gold, the power, and the soldiers. But he had also told her of the cracks that were beginning to show in their alliance. Power, after all, was fragile, and even the strongest alliances could fracture when greed and ambition took hold. That night, Joran arrived in her chambers with news. His face was shadowed, his steps quick. She knew by the look in his eyes that something had changed. "Elira," he began, his voice tight with urgency. "The time is now. The old man's health has worsened again. The court is already discussing the succession. Your mother believes she can take control without opposition, but there's a rift in the faction. Some of them are starting to doubt her. They want more power, and they want it now." Elira felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when the old man's death would open the door to a new era. But it was also a dangerous moment. Her mother was no fool. She would not let go of her ambition so easily. Elira had to strike before her mother could fully solidify her position. "How do we move?" Elira asked, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. Jorn stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with a quiet intensity. "There's a banquet in 2 days. Your mother plans to announce her control over the throne. She'll be in full view of the court, making her claim known. It's the perfect moment. If we act quickly, we can use this to our advantage." Elira's mind raced. The banquet was a public event, an opportunity for her mother to solidify her hold on the kingdom. But it was also an opportunity for Elira. If she could act decisively, if she could expose her mother's betrayal, the court would turn against her. They would see that Elira was the true ruler, the true queen. "I need you to get close to the right people," Elira said, her voice low. "Find out who's wavering, who can be swayed. We'll need them to turn on her." Joran nodded, his eyes burning with quiet resolve. "I'll handle it, but you must be prepared, Elira. The moment you expose your mother's intentions, there will be no turning back. The court will either rally behind you or they will tear you apart." "I understand," Elira replied. Her voice was colder than it had been before, harder. She was no longer just a girl thrust into a political game. She was a queen, her kingdom to command, her destiny to shape. The night of the banquet arrived sooner than she had expected. Elira stood before the mirror in her chambers, adjusting her crown, the heavy gold pressing against her brow. She had been trained for this moment, trained to command the room, to project strength and confidence. But beneath the surface, there was a storm brewing. The kingdom's fate was in her hands now, and one wrong move could cost her everything. As she entered the grand hall, the eyes of the entire court turned to her. Her mother stood at the center, the picture of regal composure, surrounded by the most powerful men and women in the kingdom. But Elira could feel the tension in the air, the undercurrent of fear and uncertainty that rippled through the room. The old man sat in his chair at the far end of the hall, his frail body propped up by attendants. His eyes were half closed, his mind clearly wandering, but he was still a symbol of power. For now, Elira stepped forward, her gaze sweeping over the room. She felt their eyes on her, some with admiration, others with suspicion, and some with outright disdain. She had not yet revealed her hand, but tonight she would, and she would make sure that everyone knew who the true queen was. Her mother began to speak, her voice smooth and controlled, as she outlined her plans for the kingdom's future. But Elira's eyes never left her. She could see the cracks in her mother's facade, the slight tension in her posture, the subtle shift in her tone as she spoke of the future. The moment was approaching, and when the time came, Elira would strike. The great hall pulsed with tension. Beneath the glow of candlelight and chandeliers, smiles were painted on like masks, each one hiding ambition, fear, or treachery. Elira stood tall in her midnight blue gown, her crown glinting beneath the flickering flames. Her heartbeat was steady now. She had trained for this moment, bled for it in silence. Her mother was mid-speech, weaving grand promises of unity and prosperity, of a seamless transition of power, as if the kingdom were some gift to be handed down. Elira's gaze swept across the crowd, ministers nodding with feigned agreement, soldiers stiff with expectation, and nobles exchanging wary glances. Joran was among them, near a stone pillar, his posture relaxed, but his eyes locked on Elira's. The plan had been set. There would be no turning back. As her mother raised her goblet to toast a new chapter for the realm, Elira took her first step forward, her voice ringing out like a blade slicing through silk. "Let us drink," she said, "but not to a lie." The room froze. All heads turned. Queen Verena slowly lowered her goblet, the warmth in her smile slipping. "Elira," she said softly, "this is not your place." "It is exactly my place," Elira replied, stepping fully into the center of the hall. "I am the crown queen of this realm, not by marriage or maneuvering, but by right. And tonight, the court deserves the truth." Her mother's eyes narrowed. "What truth do you speak of?" Elira turned to the gathering. "You've all heard the whispers of illness, of power shifting in the dark, of alliances made behind closed doors. But you've not heard what truly matters. How this court was manipulated into accepting a marriage built on betrayal. How the queen, my mother, sold her daughter to her own husband to secure her grip on the throne." Gasps rippled through the hall. Some nobles looked away. Others stared in stunned disbelief. Elira pressed on. "She told me it was for the kingdom, that I was a tool, but I am not her tool. I am not his wife. I am your queen." A loud thud echoed as the old man's cane dropped from his weakening hand. Propped up in his throne, his eyes were bloodshot, his breathing labored. "She lies," he rasped. "She's a child, drunk on ambition." "Then let them see what truth ambition brings," Elira cut him off, turning to Joran. He stepped forward, and with a nod, two palace guards moved to the dais, not toward Elira, but toward the old man. The air turned electric. "What is this?" the queen hissed, stepping between them. "You dare move against your king?" "The king is dying," Joran said simply, "and your daughter speaks with the voice of the future." More guards appeared, emerging from behind the columns, from side halls. Loyalists Elira had gathered, men and women tired of decay and cowardice, ready for change. The queen spun to Elira. "You would turn your blade against me?" "No," Elira said coldly, "but I will not let you rule through me any longer." Verena's mask cracked. "You don't know what power truly is." "I know enough to take it," Elira whispered. Then chaos erupted. Steel was drawn. Shouts rang through the chamber as Verina's faction reacted, some rushing to protect her, others hesitating, uncertain where to stand. The old man tried to rise, but his legs failed him, and he collapsed with a groan. His guards stepped forward, only to be blocked by Illyra's. Amid the clash, Illyra stood motionless, watching her kingdom fracture and reform in real time. She saw who fought for greed, who fought for survival, and who, just maybe, fought for her. Joran reached her side, slightly winded. The loyalists are holding the doors. We have the numbers. She nodded. End this. Spare those who surrender. Kill only those who seek to kill. And then she did the unthinkable. She walked toward her mother. Verina had not fled. Of course she hadn't. She stood in defiance, blood on her sleeve, a dagger in one hand. Do you think I didn't plan for this? She hissed. Illyra stopped a few feet away, close enough to smell the faint perfume that used to comfort her as a child. Maybe you did, but you underestimated me. You think ruling is about courage? Verina spat. It's about sacrifice. I gave up everything to keep this kingdom intact, even you. That, Illyra said softly, was your greatest mistake. Verina lunged, but Illyra was ready. Steel met steel. The dagger clattered across the floor. In a heartbeat, Illyra had drawn the thin ceremonial blade at her side and pressed it to her mother's throat. The queen froze, breath shallow, eyes wide. I could end you here, Illyra said, her voice steady. But I won't. That would make me you. Around them, the hall quieted. The fighting had ceased. The court stared at the scene, the outcome hanging on the edge of a blade. Illyra stepped back. Let her be confined. She will live to see what real power looks like, not through manipulation, but through justice. Joran gave the signal. Guards seized Queen Verina, dragging her away in silence. She didn't struggle. Illyra turned to the throne. The old man had slumped in his seat, his chest barely rising. He was finished, not by a blade, but by time and truth. She stepped to the dais and faced the court. This kingdom has long been ruled by ghosts, she said, her voice carrying, by those clinging to a past of greed, of fear, of using others to build empires they never truly earned. That ends tonight. She removed her crown. And then, in front of them all, she placed it back on her head, herself, with no priest, no mother, no king beside her. I am Queen Illyra, not a tool, not a child, but the ruler this kingdom needs. Silence. Then one by one, those in the hall began to kneel, not because they were forced, but because they had chosen her. Joran stood at her side, quiet for a long moment. Then he whispered, You won. Illyra didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, beyond the stained glass windows, where the first hints of dawn began to appear. No, she said, I've just started.